We're going to talk about mental health, but not in the way that the media is normally talking to you about mental health. Like, let's talk about mental health. You probably don't feel okay. That's because mental health is not talked about enough. No, we're going to ask the question, by talking about it, are we getting less of it? Meaning, are we worse by all of this rhetoric? Well, studies show that we are literally wrecking an entire generation of humans by telling them that they're not okay. And we are doing it inside the Trojan horse of mental health. Shockingly, even the New York Times thinks so. This was an op-ed published over the weekend, and I'm honestly a bit surprised at the honesty in this piece, given that the New York Times normally falls right in line for the biopharmaceutical complex. But what they're doing here is acknowledging that all of this focus on mental health is making young people worse, and we're not helping because the narrative around it is telling people, you have all of these conditions like anxiety and depression, your life is too hard, you can't handle it. And then that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They talk about how this is not a way to empower teens to deal with the world. It just makes it worse. And what's worse is when celebrities like the Princes of England do this. This is one of their favorite causes. These two brothers hate each other, apparently, but they agree on this. They can always get a microphone if they want to talk about mental health. That was William. Here's Harry talking about mental health. Now, maybe they think they're doing a good thing. I'm sure they do. They think they're giving back with their platform. But if they bothered to study, they would know that psychologists have long since known that naming a condition has a social contagion, meaning you get more of it. Point in case is the true story of anorexia and bulimia in the UK. Their mother, Princess Diana, in 1995, she did this famous interview with the BBC, and she admitted that she struggled with bulimia. Well, after that interview, incidences of bulimia skyrocketed in the UK and other Western nations. The media says that, well, she helped people heal from it. They called it the Diana effect. They said that after she did this, the study by the Institute of Psychiatry in London showed that they had 60,000 new cases after her revelation. Now, that's an interesting question, right? Were those cases already there, or was this copycat neuroses? That's an interesting question, right?
Do we know? I think it's copycat.
I think a lot of evidence suggests that it is social contagion, that she gave people a template for what it looks like to act out self-loathing and helplessness. And they were like, oh, okay, well, that's what I'm going to do, either consciously or subconsciously. Now, am I saying people didn't really suffer from bulimia? Of course they did. They played out what she had shown them, and people got quite sick from it. Researchers have known for a long time that when you name a mental condition, you get more of it. There is a social contagion. Now, this is something we're not supposed to say these days because they don't like to acknowledge how it relates to transgender ideology, but research has absolutely shown that there is a social contagion. Now, 13 years ago, journalist Ethan Waters published this work, which I do think holds the test of time. This was published in 2010. I want to recommend it wholeheartedly. He studied conditions like PTSD, eating disorders, trauma around the world, and showed just how most of them are sold to other countries by big pharma. The chapter on Japan and anorexia is especially shocking, and just how deliberate that was from big pharma. But I want to tell you about this. Do you recall in 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami? It was awful, terrible story of destruction. But what happened in the aftermath of that tsunami was that mental health workers from the West mostly descended on Sri Lanka to tell everyone there that they were traumatized. In fact, research has shown since that made them a lot worse because in Sri Lanka, they had sort of cultural ways that they dealt with tragedies in the past. Those cultural survival strategies had nothing to do with focusing on how you feel as an individual, focusing on yourself. Mostly it focused on helping other people, helping your community. But in fact, we kind of messed them up because the West taught them to navel gaze, to focus on their damn selves instead of their community, and it made them hurt more. In fact, this led Waters to conclude that there is not a human universal when it comes to reactions to trauma. And maybe, just maybe, focusing on ourselves makes things worse. Well, this is what another study found, just published last month in October of 2023. What they did here is they grouped teens into two groups. One group took standard health classes. The other did something called WISE Teens, which is a social emotional skills training. It turns out that the students in the WISE group reported more depression, more anxiety, more difficulty managing their emotions, and worse relationships with their parents. And they also felt that every negative emotion was stigmatized. Now, the researchers say, well, we don't think these kids were really engaged in this program, so maybe it has to, which begs the question, because a lot of these programs are not standardized. They come from just like, whatever these local teachers can find. There's the same thing in Sri Lanka. They had no standardization to like treat these people. They would just be like, oh, you lost your whole family in a tsunami. Can I treat you? And then however you were going to do it, right? Now the researchers say, well, we think these kids, they just weren't very engaged with it. Or did the actual act of this teach them that they are not strong enough to deal with life? Like we gave them this language. Oh, I feel badly. This must be anxiety. I must be sick. These studies have been repeated over and over again. This language that telling people that they're not strong enough and their mental health is weak makes them more weak. Here's what the New York Times said about it. They had this Lucy Fox, Oxford psychologist, say, this is called prevalence inflation, when greater awareness of mental illness leads people to talk of normal life struggles in terms of symptoms and diagnoses. These sort of labels begin to dictate how people view themselves, and it becomes self-fulfilling. Teenagers who are still developing their identities are especially prone to take psychological labels to heart. Instead of, I am nervous about X, a teenager will say, I can't do X because I have anxiety. Those are really powerful examples, you guys. It's teaching a child that they have no agency in how they respond to things because this is just something that's happening to them. They just don't have mental health. They say that these teens are self-diagnosing and pathologizing commonplace emotions of the problems of life. Now, this is something that researcher Thomas Szasz, who has long since passed, but he was a researcher in the 60s who started warning about over-medicalizing everything. He called this the no-fault disease. Nothing's your fault. You can't be expected to handle it. This is a really powerless way to live. He wrote in 2001 that right now we are healthier than ever, but more afraid of disease than ever. He called that the therapeutic state. That's when government convinces you that you're sick or you may be really sick, so you must defer to all medicalization of every human experience. He warned us that this will come of our inability to distinguish between disease, discomfort, and deviance. So think about this. Look at his definitions when you think about what is a disease. And when we use these terms like mental health disease and mental health disorder, right? A disease is an alteration in the structure or function of the body. It happens only at a cellular level. Disease is abnormal activity of the body, not the person. Discomfort is the complaint of an individual about their own body or behavior. Pain, fatigue, depression. That's discomfort. It's not a disease.
Oh, so they don't have a disease. It's just discomfort. And we're raising literally a generation of people to not experience discomfort. We need to insulate them like bubble wrap.
Right.
So they
and
can't
then deviance is when, individuals, it identifies the complaint of individuals about the behaviors of others. Like deviance is, alcoholism, which I'm going to get to, or obesity or what have you, illicit sexual behavior. Now, in our society, we use this term disease to diagnose everything from pyromania to kleptomania. Everything now is a disease, right? Why do we do this? Well, the history of government medicine provides a clue. Did you know that psychiatrists were the first doctors ever to be compensated by the state? They were psychiatrists. And so it is in the best interest of the therapeutic state to sell us this idea that our discomforts are diseases because we have a drug. They have drugs to sell us for it, right? So we've seen this with alcoholism. That's not a disease. It's not a cellular dysfunction. In fact, alcoholism, I'm just going to give you this little aside, was developed by this AAA who gets funding from big alcohol to sell you this idea that only some people can't tolerate alcohol and the rest of us can. That is a lie. No human body can tolerate alcohol. It's a carcinogen. We're told this to sell ourselves the idea of drinking in moderation, and that's why it fits to use alcoholism as a disease. It's not. Nobody can handle alcohol. Same thing with processed food. Obesity, not a disease. Obesity causes disease. Where does it come from? Well, it's some pretty actually interesting manipulation from food science that's meant to hijack your brain. For that, I really want to recommend this book, The Dorito Effect. Really interesting about how your body thinks it's getting something from junk food and why you crave it, and there's nothing there. Now, am I saying obesity is a no-fault disease? No. But processed food works on the brain like alcoholism. And again, we're selling ourselves these ideas that only some people can't handle it and the rest of us can. There's money there. There are people who want you to think that. Now, does this mean there's no mental disease? Well, according to Thomas Szasz, there isn't. I don't want to make that argument full stop, and you're free to point me to other places. But this is an interesting argument that I just want to entertain the research of Thomas Szasz, because once you look into the history of mental health, it's not a great history. He talks about where we got the idea of mental disease was from this guy. Schizophrenia was invented in 1924 by Eugene Bleuler, who used to treat patients without their consent. And in 1911, he called this dementia precox schizophrenia, and he said it was an uncontested medical dogma, and they used this to justify incarceration and treatment of people without their consent. And then, there you go. There's some drugs that go along with it. So this is, I want to recommend that you read a book called Pharmacracy if you're really interested in how we got from this to medicalization of all discomforts. So that brings up the idea of these kids today. Do we have any data that would show that all of this mental health discussion makes them better? We don't. In fact, we're starting to get data that shows that it could make them worse. In which case, if your child in their school has all of this promotion around mental health awareness, that would seem to me that we're experimenting on young people because we don't know that it makes them better, however well-intentioned. Maybe it's making them worse. Does that mean that all health professionals are bad people, or, people teaching these courses are bad? Of course not. I think they're well-intentioned. But do they know that their methods will help, or do they maybe need to think about how they would cause harm? And in fact, there are professionals trying to raise the alarm about this. This is Stanford Dean Julie Lythcott-Hames. She writes in her fantastic book, How to Raise an Adult, that children who have no life skills and who are young adults and are coddled have actually more anxiety because the world seems so scary to them. So not only are we telling children they're too weak, but we're not helping them to become strong enough or giving them the tools when it's hard. And this is where the New York Times then goes off the rails and actually suggests non-pharmaceutical aid for mental health just to cope for kids. They say maybe we need more prosaic things like sleep, decreased homework burden, play, exercise, music, arts, community engagement, all things that, used to be once coping mechanisms because life is hard. And so you think about the way that we're talking to young people by just telling them, you can't handle it, it's too hard, this is not your fault, it's outside of you, it's a no-fault disease, right? Or what if we told our kids, this is really hard, we need to toughen you up and get you ready to handle it? Would that maybe help these kids? So let me know what you think of all of this research in the chat.
I'd like to point out something that was a sobering fact when I realized it. And this was, it was a discussion I had because I used to work in the health science library at Ball State. And anyway, I was with the head librarian, but we were talking about this. But I could get cancer. They could say, well, we can operate on that cancer and you should be fine. You can take this medication, you should be fine. And I can say, nope, and there's nothing the hospital can do about it. I can just be like, I'm just going to go live with my cancer and die.
Yeah.
And they're like, they have to go with that. Mental health, they can force you
Yes.
to take treatment. So they cannot force you. No hospital can force you to take a life-saving procedure, but they can force you to take a mental health procedure.
Yes.
A
Yeah.
court can order it to be done.
Why
Yeah.
is
That's
that?
not scary. Like, just when you think of the grip that the mental health professionals have, like, to me, that's the most frightening thing ever. Because
Yes.
if somebody's just like, you have a problem, I'm like, no, I don't. They're like, yes, you do, and we're treating you for it, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. It's totally out of your control because of,
biopharmaceutical complex.
yeah, because of the sort of there's a long history there of how this unfolded from these days of like incarcerating mental health patients against their will, and how we really aren't
and I
that
think-
far from that.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of an incarceration with all these kids with the gender stuff, because the pharmaceutical industry is preying upon them and their weakness and promoting this gender ideology, and we're all affirming their mental illness. And so, I just feel bad for kids that are in that situation that are being preyed upon.
Babby in our chat says facts. That's right. You have 2 doctors here, I guess, in their household. Says that's facts. 2 doctors here. It's sad. I mean, it's crazy.
Because I could go to court and say, I think my brother David is crazy, and if that court agrees, he could be forcibly institutionalized and medicated against his will.
Wow.
Yeah.
Please don't do
And
that.
there's just nothing he could.
Can we take up a
I'm thinking
petition?
about it. You better be nice to me.
That's
How
the
much of that steak
therapeutic
are you
state.
gonna share with me on Thanksgiving?
That's crazy.
as much as you
Yeah.
want.
I mean, look what happened to Britney Spears, for crying out loud. I don't know if that's the same thing or
I
not.
don't know if we want to use her as a success story
just
for
was thinking
mental
about-
health. She dances with knives.
Yeah. But
Yeah, don't put Britney Spears in this.
I was just thinking of Britney.
Okay.
It always comes back to Britney for
In
me.
this story. Yeah, well, let us know what you think. And as long as you're going through some of these books that I recommended, I do highly recommend Pharmocracy by Thomas Saz from the early 90s before he passed away in, I think, 2001 or 2008. But he warned about this for a very long time. And we have continued to march down this path of like everything is a disease. And it maybe is not helping us. Maybe, a lot of times there's always some mom who comes to me who's like, we need to get involved in this with the girls. And I always say to them, no, my job is only to prepare my daughter for that situation. My job is not to control that situation. And the moms are always like, what?
The moms can't. It's amazing to me to hear this
Yeah.
moms group, because they're like, they can't handle it. They're like, my daughter, I'm going to have to call the school and do something. We're like, no, you're not. We're not calling the school. We're going to let our daughter handle it. She's got to handle this and navigate
Yeah.
this world herself. We're going to set up a generation of snowflakes.
Right.
They can't handle any adversity in their life.
Yeah.
Like we are put here on this earth to grow from discomfort, right? You have to be stressed in order to grow. It's how you deal with it.
Your discomfort is a disease.
But now it's a disease, and I need to take some sort of medication for it, I guess, to
Right.
tamp me down, like bubble wrap and wrap me up in some sort of brain fog.
Yeah.
And just go through the rest of my life like a zombie, I guess. That's what we want. Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.